Federalism is a concept found in any basic introductory American government course. It's a concept that always seems to give students trouble. Students struggle with understanding and comprehending federalism, and I think the reason is that because it's a system of divided power, they confuse it with other systems of divided power or other concepts of divided power, such as the separation of powers doctrine or checks and balances and so forth. So my interest in providing this brief video tutorial is not necessarily to go through all of the material from the chapter, because in any course there's an entire chapter devoted to the concept of federalism. There's a lot of nuances to understanding how it's implemented, policy and legal and political implications, but that's not my interest here in this brief tutorial. My interest is to provide a basic working understanding of the concept of federalism itself. Okay, so let's go ahead and get a definition going here, and that is, as you see on the screen in front of you, the constitutional division of power between the national and subnational governments. So federalism is this concept of divided power between a national and a subnational government. One of the key words in this definition is it's the constitutional division of power in the United States, because the division of power between the national and subnational governments is not an option. It is, in fact, constitutionally mandated. Now, to what degree power is given to the national or subnational governments is a different story. But the fact is that the Constitution requires that there be this division of power. Now, let's make sure we understand some of the terminology here. When we talk about the national government in this definition, make sure you understand that national government is the same thing as the United States government, the federal government, or the central government. In other words, if you read the newspaper or watch the news, or you hear someone lecturing about government or federalism, you have to understand the context in which they're using particular words. But if someone refers to the U.S. government, or the federal government, or the central government, it is the same thing as referring to the national government. Now, the term central government is the same thing as saying national government. It isn't really a term that is used much in the United States. It's used quite often in other Western democracies in Europe and so forth to describe their national governments. But again, you have to make sure you understand the context and language in terms of how terms are used. So we have the national government and subnational governments. In this case, we're talking about states. Sub meaning 1 degree below, national and subnational governments. So there is this division of power. We have multiple levels of government in the United States. So let's kind of flesh this out a little bit more. And on the next chart here, we have 3 systems of government. Now, we learn what our system is. Let me go back to that. We learn what our system is and is not by learning other systems of power. So here we have the unitary, the confederal, and the federal systems of power. Now, in a unitary system of divided power, the division is not required. It's that the strong central government has all of the mandated power, all of the power given to it, and if there is going to be a division of power, it is going to be because they give power away to local governments or state governments. So power flows one way. In a confederal system, it's the opposite. The states, the subnational governments, possess all of the power, legally speaking, and if they want to create or empower a strong national or central government, they can, but the central government does not have the right of existence on its own, naturally. So we have a system of federalism. Now, here we see the term federal being used to describe federalism. And I left that way because I want you to be clear that when people refer to federalism, sometimes they refer to it as a federal system of divided power. So again, you have to understand the context in which people are using these terms. Because if someone were talking about the federal government, or a federal branch of the government, then they would be talking about the national government. But if someone used the term federal to describe a federal system of divided power, they'd be talking essentially about federalism. They'd just be referring to it as a federal form of divided power. So you really have to understand the context in which people are using these terms. Now, obviously our country has a history with confederalism, the Confederacy in the South, where during the Civil War the states broke away and wanted to essentially have what we had before the current U.S. Constitution, and that was the Articles of Confederation. And then a unitary system of government, although it does play out between states and local governments, such as in California, it is the relationship between the California state government and local governments, as your California textbook points out. Unitary form of government can be found, for example, in Great Britain. So, again, in Great Britain, there can be local governments, just using that as an example, but all the government is, all of the power of government is centrally located, and if they want to disperse that power, to have a division of power, they can. To make this, or try to help you understand this a little bit more, let's just move into this chart, which is saying the same thing, only with a different graphic. Let me change to my pen in case I need it. So up here on the left we have the unitary form of government. And as you can see, in the unitary form of government, just like the previous slide and the definitions pointed out, that power flows one way. In that chart you see that the power is being dispersed from the central government out, because they hold the power, and if they want to have a division of power, they can. Remember, there is this line right here, and that line is essentially the division of power between the central government and the state or local governments. And because the power flows one way, it is flowing outward from the central government, and the central government itself has the ability to distribute that to create regional governments if they want. And again, here in the confederal system, we have this line right here, and the arrows obviously are flowing from the states toward the central government. So just as the previous definition, or the previous slide and the definitions that existed there explained, we have state and local governments in a confederal form of government, and if that have all of the constitutional or legal power, and if they want to divide power and give some of that power to a central government, they can and do. Now, on the far side here, we have the system of federalism. Okay, and the system of federalism here is, again, we have this line here, but the difference is that power is shared. The arrows go both ways. And that the arrows going both ways is an example of shared power. It signifies shared power because the Constitution gives certain power to the central government, in our case what we refer to as the national U.S. or federal government, and then the Constitution provides power to the states in our system as well. So in other words, the states cannot do away with the federal government, and the federal government cannot do away with states necessarily. And that's because the Constitution requires that there be a division of power. Okay, and that's why it is shared power. That's why the arrows go back and forth. Now, to reiterate what we were talking about with the other slides, I have this flow chart that I've developed. Now, the U.S. Constitution is at the top because, as we know from the previous chapters, all power in the United States at all levels derives from the U.S. Constitution. So we have the U.S. Constitution at the top. We have this red line here in the middle, and that red line signifies federalism, that there's this division of power between the U.S. government and the state governments. So again, and why is that? Because federalism is a system of constitutionally divided power. We have right here, okay, the U.S. federal government, all right, and right here we have the state governments. And I drew those lines that way because the Constitution is what allows state governments to exist, and it is also what allows the federal government to exist. Okay, And so we have that divided power that comes from the Constitution itself. Now here we have the U.S. federal government. And the U.S. federal government itself has 3 branches of power. And we know that those 3 branches of power are separated based on the separation of powers doctrine from the previous chapters. So in this one level of government, this one entity of government, the U.S. federal government, the national government, we have a system of divided power which is known as separation of powers. We're dividing the functions of government. This is where I think the confusion comes in for students, because there's so many different divisions of power in government that they confuse where federalism divides power versus the other concepts. So again, we have judicial, executive, and legislative, and then we have these overlapping powers. Don't forget that we have these overlapping powers of essentially checks and balances, right? We have overlapping powers of checks and balances between the judicial, executive, and legislative. Again, those checks and balances, the power of checks and balances is different from separation of powers because essentially it allows a degree of oversight. It's overlapping powers. Now at the state level, we also have our 3 branches of government. And those 3 branches of government are separated based on the separation of powers doctrine at the state level. And of course, they have overlapping powers as well in that sense. This line in the middle is federalism. And the Constitution requires that there is a division of power between the U.S. federal government, okay, and the state governments. That doesn't mean that necessarily state governments are always inferior. In this chart, it's a vertical chart. It shows the federal government above the state governments. And in many cases that is true, because we know the Supremacy Clause says that if there's a conflict in areas where both the state government and the federal government are allowed to legislate, that federal law and constitutional law will always prevail. Okay, but there are many areas of state government that the federal government is not allowed to touch. And so in that sense, quite often we can refer to the division of power as essentially a horizontal division and not a vertical division. But because the U.S. Constitution provides the federal government the Supremacy Clause, supreme power of the country, if there's a conflict between the state and federal government, I'm drawing it in a vertical way. So again, I'm having all of these lines drawn to show you that the U.S. government flows from the U.S. Constitution, as does the right of state governments to exist. And again, we have our breakdown within each level. Each state has its own judicial, executive, and legislative branch, and each state separates their functions, and each state has its overlapping checks and balances doctrines. And again, federalism, again, is a division of power between the national and the subnational governments. We don't really refer to federalism as a separation of power. If we're just going by the English language, yes, it is separating power between the federal government and the state governments. But the reason we don't refer to federalism as a separation of powers is because it will confuse people with the separation of powers doctrine that separates the functions of one particular level of government. So, for example, in this case, we have the judicial, executive, and legislative of the U.S. federal government. Those 3 branches are all within one level of government. In the California government, there are 3 branches of government. They're all under one level of government. Separation of powers is about separating the functions of government of a particular level of government. That is different than the division of power, federalism, that says we're going to have more than one level of government. Okay? That's the difference. Federalism is about having multiple levels of government required by the Constitution, and the separation of powers doctrine is about separating the powers within one level of government, even though we have multiple levels of government. So I hope all my lines didn't confuse you too much, but again, just trying to kind of draw that out as I talk it out. Feel free to follow up with any questions, either in an email, discussion board, or if I post this on my my personal website for video lectures, feel free to make a comment in the comments section below that. Okay? Thank you so much.